It is February 27th, Pirkei Avot class at Ohr Shalom Synagogue. And we're going to get started. The Mishnah for today is 3:18, but before we jump into 3:18, go back to last week to 3:17, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. We were with that Mishnah for 2 weeks, and it was the two pieces, the series of two items that were each mutually codependent. So Marilyn, you wanted to...
Well, a lot of the discussion that we heard was about the difference between knowledge and understanding, and then Al and I were able to stop the video actually and discuss what we thought. But and I agree that knowledge without understanding, or what looks like knowledge without understanding, is sometimes like gibberish, and that on some level, even if it's on the very basic level, all knowledge requires some understanding, some background, some context. But what I thought was interesting in the news this week is the whole discussion about the change in the curriculum and the evaluation of what is going to be the latest the latest core curriculum, because we do this every couple of years. But one of the issues is whether or not we are now educating our students based on multiple choice testing, to just be able to throw out the factoids and the attempt to try to make it be something that is based on some understanding. And the difficulty with that, which is why probably this won't be any more successful than any other time we've tried to do this, is that it's very hard to evaluate understanding, because understanding comes in a lot of different layers and from a lot of different perspectives, and it's not cut and dry where you can say, okay, now you have complete understanding of this, or you have a partial understanding and you're kind of on your way. It's very in flux, and it's very hard. And going back to the Torah and all of these other things, it's very hard to really get to the point, and maybe impossible to get to the point of complete understanding. There's always the next level. And so if you relate it to Torah, then that goes with the idea that you never stop, right?
Outstanding.
You can't stop because there's never end to that. Good.
And I would just suggest also that not all understanding is hierarchical. That is, some understanding, when you take that next step, it prepares you for another step, but there also are parallel understandings. Exactly. So some people understand it through, and whether it goes into Gardner's multiple intelligences or other ways, but there are things that, it's one thing to go from the Bohr atom to hybrid orbitals to quantum mechanics, which is hierarchical and builds. But it's another to understand things really in kind of a parallel way, that there's a fundamentally different way to understand that material, that's just a different way to understand. And in terms of the changes and the ever-changing core curriculum and the changes the way we evaluate, I'm just personally fascinated by the relationship between education and education technologies. Ruth's son has a degree in education technologies. And so, the spectrum of learning, first in a world pre-textbooks, right? So Shana yesterday went on the 5th grade field trip to Knott's Berry Farm, has that Independence Hall, sort of old world experience, and they have that old schoolhouse. So a classroom with no textbooks, with blackboards, and even with students with individual blackboards and I almost said markers. What are those things called? Chalk?
Chalk.
And what education means in that context in terms of knowledge, what we will think of as rote memorization, and understanding as to what happens with that knowledge, and fast forward to some generations, and it's only a couple of generations really of textbooks of the world in which, and you guys probably run the gamut. That is, some of you, but not all of you, probably had textbooks for all your subjects, going back to little kid school, not just, college. And now moving into a world away from textbooks and away from books, away from what we think of as the codex, as the printed volume, and into a digital medium, and what it means both for instruction and what it means for learning, and as part how we evaluate learning. because the learning that I did, even if much of the material is the same, is fundamentally a different style of learning, and the modality of instruction matters a lot, certainly than it was for my grandparents, right? Early 20th century wasn't the world of textbooks and so forth, and it's not the world that my children are in terms of how the digital medium or digital media has changed education, and not just in the world of edutainment, not about YouTube videos and other fun things, but in terms of meaningful education. What a smartboard means in a classroom. We used to, play games by standing behind somebody and doing flashcard drills, and what it means in a room where everybody has their own computer and their own tablet and they're all linked and so forth. That the medium actually does matter, and it's related to the testing, right? Because with the increase in technologies, become new possibilities of mass testing that didn't used to exist, that have value and benefits and have real detraction to them in terms of what it means. And I think it's also, make it immediate, we're studying a text that is nearly 2,000 years old, right? It's as a written text, it's an 18th century old text. And for most of that history, it's been learned by most people as an oral tradition. Not as an oral tradition in contradistinction to the Torah, which is a written distinction, but for most of the, English is fun, the yeshivas and the cheder and the shuls in which this material would have been taught, people would not have their own text and would not have, we're doing a handout, or some have it digital, right? For most of the places, there would be somebody teaching it who probably had it. Mishnah Avot's a little bit different because there is a tradition of printing it in prayer books. So, if we think of it more as Mishnah, I'm more correct. If we think of it more as Avot, it's a little less correct, but still, functionally the same idea.
Yeah. And in terms of knowledge and context, I'll just add based upon what you said, because I don't know if everybody realizes, because most people probably aren't Southern California natives, to think that Hebrew Day School goes to Knott's Berry Farm.
Correct.
I mean, when I was growing up, if you were Jewish, he was among the most anti-Semitic people.
It goes both ways, that they would go and that they would be permitted to go.
Right.
That's kind of surprising, isn't it?
Well, because it's
I didn't know he was anti-Semitic.
Yeah, it wasn't the friendliest of places.
It's like drinking a Coors beer.
I don't
was worse.
Yeah, I don't know in terms of the Coors family or the general German connection.
No, the Coors family.
So, stuff I don't know. For whatever it's worth, it's not my favorite beer, just on taste, but different issue. But it is interesting, and the way that it works. All right, anybody else to add?
Yes.
Good. Mark?
As we're moving away from...
At some point we'll be so in there.
Educational system is changing quite a bit.
Uh-huh.
So you can sit and read a document online. I think the importance of learning in a group with people is of value, and I don't know how much value is placed on that anymore. I work with students at UCSD, and one was accepted to School of Pharmacy in University of North Carolina, and she doesn't think she wants to go there because it's a remote pharmacy school, and so you have a screen.
Yeah, and the first time it's who they play, and then it's making selection.
Yeah, so she's not too happy, even though it's probably a very good school to go to, because you don't have a person in front of you.
Correct.
My rabbi's not in front of me, or my teacher, whoever it is. So I think there's value, and I don't know if we're moving away, because I've talked to a lot of students that are taking courses online now, and you can learn a lot online, but there's a certain value of having someone's presence.
Correct. So these are all the changes that are structural changes that change the nature of every piece. It changes the nature of education. It changes the nature of instructor, teacher, professor. It changes the nature of student, learner. And it changes, it changes our knowledge and our understanding.
And also, if it's in the math situation, usually you can see a sentence You know if you understand everything.
Correct.
If you understand everything. If it's a myth, then it's never.
And that's true in both directions. When you're in a group of learning,
Exactly.
when you're in a group with the learning experience, as opposed to if everybody is atomized, you, the instructor, don't really know if anybody gets it. And even when it's relatively interactive, it's much less interactive than when you're in a room. And you as the student, it's really easy when you don't get something to look around and decide if anybody else is lost or if you're the only lost one. So in both directions, the nature of the group learning experience is fun. And we are a tradition. It's really fun. It's one of, I think I mentioned it, I've been asked next fall to teach a 500 level class at State on Kabbalah. I don't know. I get to be sexy at San Diego State for one semester. And there's so much of the folklore that we know about Kabbalah that we don't really understand. But part of the radical nature of at least one understanding through the late Middle Ages of Kabbalah is this idea that there can never be more than two people in the room when Kabbalah is taught. Meaning, it is, I love the Star Wars parallel, but it's Sith. It's a master and an apprentice. That's it. And that doesn't necessarily, depending on who you talk to, that doesn't necessarily sound so radical, except we are a tradition where we may have something called Chavruta, which is not a teacher and a student, but two students, right? Two people paired together. But we are a lot of people in the same room talking at the same time kind of community. And in our pedagogical models are like that. Maybe not a lot of people, but certainly not an individual and not even two people. And most times, the dyad of Chavruta study is in a context with a bunch of pairs present, so that there's more interaction even than just whoever is sitting right across the table from me. Anyway, so it's really neat to think about that and what it means for the definition of knowledge and understanding. Because coming back to Marilyn's point, and then unless anybody has something else to add, we'll move on. Is knowledge is now, in many places, defined as those things which you can be right by making the 1 out of 4 choice, as opposed to being able to say what year was the Declaration of Independence signed, to ask the question, was it signed in 1676 or 1776 or 1870, right? And so it's a different level of knowledge to be able to. And by the way, the interesting thing in terms of things that are conspiring against all of us is at the same time that that's happening, when the threshold of knowledge is much less, when I have to know enough to recognize which of the 4 is correct. So at the same time that I don't need to have the same knowledge base to do a multiple choice as questions with short answer, questions with blanks. We've also, it lowers the level, we've also moved into a world where I really don't need to know all that much, because I have instant access to more information than pretty much any human being ever had, even in their own library before. So,
and even more so, the question might be, what was going on in 1776?
Correct.
Instead of
just the dates, just the fact,
and not what happened, but what was going on. So the level of understanding is doesn't have. You could have multiple answers, multiple correct answers.
Correct.
To a question that's based on understanding, which you cannot have if the question is based on multiple choice or
Outstanding. So as our math teacher walks in,
exactly,
it's the difference between simply grading on answer as opposed to, I was very lucky, I had a number of outstanding teachers all the way through who had to show you work and were willing to both reward and punish if the answer was wrong, correct, but the work was correct, or the answer was right in spite of the work being incorrect, right? That is to understand that the problem solving is more than just, it's related to getting the right answer, in spite, it all comes back to Tom Lehrer, but in spite of, the answer doesn't matter, they both go hand in hand. All right, Ellen, and then we're going to push ahead.
I just want that there, in having been, when I went back to school, as an adult, and the difference in, and maybe it was because of my injury, but the difference in learning what I can learn from books and research and in the discussion group is entirely different. And I recognize that even before there was really not that there wasn't the internet, but it wasn't like this. That even for a class like this, we all read it differently, and so I think that whole thing about the remote learning and the whole that you can learn all these things from the internet. There's parts that you miss that you can't fill in without the group.
Neat. And by the way, to what extent this class is really about Mishnah Avot, and to what extent this class is really about all of us, and the Mishnah becomes the opportunity to spark and so forth. And I don't mean just the balance of what percentage of the words spoken are quotation versus utterance, but how much of the text is real, how much of the conversation or the learning is really the text, and how much of it is the text in dialogue with each of us individually, but more interestingly with all of us together, which I'll make 2 plugs and then we'll turn on to 318. One is it's always wonderful to go back and reread a series of essays published by Rosenzweig and Buber in the early to mid part of the 20th century, having to do with the dialogic nature of learning. Buber to be honest, I don't know if he published it or if it was posthumously a series of essays called On Jewish Education, and also their work on, what would you like me to do with this?
No.
Oh, it's coming to you. And also their work on translation and their understanding, coming very much from Buber, about how the text only exists in dialogue, and that the text doesn't exist as an absolute unto itself. And then I'll use it as a plug, by the way, as somebody who loves to read. I love the book club, because generally speaking, the books are wonderful. That's not universally true, and I love reading the books. But it's even more fun to sit down with 6 or 10 people who all read it differently, and to share it. So along those lines, I'm sure Sunday night will be a fun conversation. This is now 2 really fun books in a row. So Sunday night is Gigi Anders' Jubana book. All right, with that, let's turn to 318. The website is complete. The website is complete through 319 as well. So I don't know if I have photocopies of 319, but 319 is up on the website. Well, I think I do have 319 if anybody wants it, just so I don't waste the tree that I killed. Probably for next week if we make it through 318, but it's on the Ohr Shalom website. All right, 318. Let's read the Hebrew together. Hu haya omer kol shehochmato meruba mima'asav lema hu domeh le'ilan she'anafav merubin v'shorashav mu'atin ve'aruach ba'a ve'okratu ve'hufchatu al panav shene'emar v'haya ke'ar'ar be'arava ve'lo yir'eh ki yavo tov v'shachan charirim bamidbar eretz melecha ve'lo teshev aval kol shema'asav merubin me'chochmato lama hu domeh le'ilan she'anafav mu'atin v'shorashav merubin she'afilu kol haruchot sheba'olam ba'ot v'noshvot bo ein mezizin oto mimkomo shene'emar v'haya ke'et shatul al mayim ve'al yuval yishalach shorashav ve'lo yir'eh ki yavo chom ve'haya alehu ra'anan uvishnat batzoret lo yid'ad ve'lo yamish me'asot peri. All right. Outstanding. It is very nice to have you, Tilly. As you're sneaking behind me, I caught you.
Oh. Sorry.
It's nice to have Sharon too. Can you get through?
Oh, hold on.
Yeah, that's all right.
There we go. She prefers to sit over there.
All right. Sharon, do you have 318 or do you want it? I have an extra one right here. Here's an extra one. Tell me once it on. All right, so what's that? It doesn't pause. At least not that I know how. Okay.
The words are okarto v'hofachto, and it's not the first time that the mamre does incorrect vowing.
Where are you?
All right, so let's.
I know.
So they're nouns, not verbs.
They are very much verbs, and there is no u in the vowing of any of those, and it's okarto, meaning okeret oto, and hofachto, meaning hofechet oto. And the vowing in the text that you gave us is incorrect, and it's not the way we should read it. There is no u, and the shva and the patach are interchanged incorrectly.
You're on line 5?
The line 5. Fifth line.
Yes.
Okay.
Word okarto and hofachto, which is the only way to conjugate the word hofechet oto. Okeret oto. Yeah, and the a and shva are interchanged.
Yeah, I don't know. Makes sense to me. I don't know why they would vocalize it that way. Okay.
Their vowing and their punctuation.
So in this case, the meaning I think is clear.
Yeah.
And it would be clearer in the absence of the vowels. All right. So we are continuing with Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. Right. He is the who in the beginning. And interesting, by the way, we talking about different kinds of learners. He is a learner by comparison. He sets up these analogies or dissimilarities, right? So the previous one were 4 pairs, and here we have another pair. It's only 1 pair in this Mishnah, but it's much elongated. It's not simple pairing of words, but he's comparing 2 different kinds of trees, right? Or he's comparing 2 different kinds of people, really, and each gets compared to a tree. So what's the first personality type, or the first learner type, or the first sage type?
His wisdom is greater than his deeds.
Good. So wisdom is greater than his deeds. Now, again, it's always interesting. We spent much of last week talking about knowledge and understanding. So it's interesting here that the term is wisdom, which is either a generic catch-all for intellectual, or it's specifically wisdom. It's an interesting question reading it. But what would it mean for somebody who has greater wisdom than they have deeds? Or either an example, not with names. They know more than what they do. Okay?
In the heavenlies, that the same said, and that everybody is, that they don't really use their knowledge. It's just headed.
Good, so they have knowledge, but there's something selfish about it.
Exactly.
Whether they don't teach it, so they don't share it that way, or they don't put it into action. Either way, it becomes their private reserve of
it's like
wisdom.
Having many
Nice.
wisdom that ever, that it's just never, it's meaningless and it's restless.
Nice, because they hoard it. It's some form of almost a selfishness as it relates. All right, I'm going to go down the road, Louis.
I was just going to say what you did, that person's selfish, that they only bring in and they don't give out.
Nice, Jackie.
I think it means more that what they do is not, rather they know better than what they do.
It's a neat expression, by the way, to know better, right? And in this specific case, it's sort of they know more, but it's sort of they know better. They know better than their behavior reflects, whatever that means. Kind of fun.
Consultants.
They're what? Consultants.
Consultants.
No, look. We have in the congregation a young individual who's graduating college, bright, personable, and so forth, who's trying to get a consulting job. And this individual's parents, who have been in the business world for, 25 to 35 years, can't imagine who would hire their child to offer serious advice, serious. Now what specifically consulting does and how it works and what, but it really is something that, whatever. All right, Ruth.
I wanted to ask the people who talked about the selfishness, I think that the metaphor used here is trying to guide us into a
Good, so we'll
specific
get
type of knowledge which shares, if it gives shade, if it's something that people can enjoy just by it being there, that's not selfishness.
Good, so let's get to the tree. Anybody else have a general statement to make about wisdom? What was the statement? More wisdom than deeds.
Yeah. I want to understand it.
Good, and we're going to understand it through there in a second, but I want to...
Okay.
My thought about this is not exactly on target in terms of wisdom than deeds, but if we relate it to last week, then this is a different wisdom.
Good. And I think so, by the way. I think that even though it's in the name of the same sage, that wisdom here is a broader term than we use it when we talk about the triumvirate of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. I agree. I think that makes more sense than reading. But so it's compared to a tree, and what's the nature of this tree that individual with more wisdom than deeds is compared to? It's a tree with a lot of branches and very few roots. Okay? And so, on the one hand, looking at a tree, that's a prettier tree, by the way. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. My bias, my assumption is that that's a true. It may be a tree with lots of fruit. It may be all sorts of things, a lot of shade. Ruth mentioned the shade. There are a lot of good things that one can say about that tree. But what's the problem with it?
It has no basis.
And because it has no roots, what's wrong with that tree because it has no roots?
It's necessary.
It can't. It's a vulnerable tree. It's not a problem that it has lots of branches. That's a beautiful virtue, right? But because it's top heavy, right? Because its virtues don't include roots, the wind comes, and the wind will knock it over, right? Now, for both of these, we have three parts. We have the personality type, we have the tree comparison, and we have the proof text. And so I want to read, each of the two separate, there's 6 pieces, divided into 2. I want to read each half for its thirds, and then I want to read it in toto. So first we had the person, we responded to it, the know better than they do sort of person. We used a word like selfish. Now we have the tree, and when we look at the tree, and this was Ruth's comment from before, big branches is really a virtue. But the promise based on Rabbi Eliezer's analysis is the wind will come and knock it over, or knock it on its face, right? It's a lovely expression. Al panav. It will be uprooted, right? The verb is literally, and uprooted is a scary verb in the tradition. Yes. Right? Whatever it means to herbologists or arborists or anybody else, uprooted in the tradition has no good connotations. We are, as a people, are uprooted. Individuals get uprooted in ways that are both physical, in terms of exile, and metaphysical, in terms of, you could have your whole life. It's the same root, by the way, that word of essence, right, of ikar, right? So the way in which it happens.
Also infertile.
Really? Oh, that's right. Oh, I didn't even think about it. Nice.
And
like infertile. Nice. In terms of what that means for a tree. Yeah, Sharon?
Uprooting.
I'm thinking that thinking about the wisdom greater than these and then being easily uprooted, that wisdom is something that you have within yourself, and deeds brings you out into the world. So you learn more about the world and how it works, and you have more of a different kind of knowledge. And so let's say that you have a very strong belief system because you have a lot of knowledge about it. But you don't have experience out in the world. And so it's easy to be overturned.
Nice. And so notice in terms of the comments, and this is, I didn't even think about it, but in terms of where we're going, as it relates to fertility or infertility, that the tree itself is okay, but the two knocks against it, the knock against it is that it's not as permanent or not as enduring, that it can be toppled over. And there have been comments made that make it either about the tree itself, that the tree itself is uprooted, but trees that become uprooted no longer bear fruit, or no longer, depending on the tree, pod and seed, right? Bear fruit is both, we like to eat apples, but that's also the system of tree reproduction, right? And so we've commented both ways that the top-heavy, the beautiful branched, not rooted tree is a risk itself to get lost, but also is a risk that it may not be able to propagate, to perpetuate, right? So both of those have come up through it. Yeah, Suzanne?
And remember, trees get the nourishment from the root.
Nice.
If you don't have a root, you're dead.
Nice. So trees get their nourishment, that in terms of sustaining them, which they also get, by the way, from their leaves, water alone, but you also need photosynthesis. But
eventually, without root, the tree roots.
Without a root system, even without the wind, a tree could wither.
I'm just curious because here, this translation just says a tree.
Okay.
In the book I have, it refers to a tamarisk.
To a what?
Tamarisk tree? Tamarisk. Ilan, I would translate it, the interesting thing are the tree words. I wouldn't translate Ilan as a specific tree. So I don't know. Good check. There are good dictionaries behind you.
They both quote Jeremiah.
Say again?
They both quote Jeremiah.
Good.
So,
So
I wonder what
in the same context in Jeremiah. So let's get now to the quotation. So we've done the expression or the type of person. We've done the analysis or the analytical comment. But now the proof text is. Who wants to read the proof text? Let's read the proof text in the English, and then let's say, what does the proof text teach us about what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying about this person?
And he will be like the lone tree in the wilderness, and will not see when goodness comes. And he will dwell in the arid desert, a salty land which will not be inhabited.
Good. So what is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is reading this verse as a commentary to the person whose wisdom exceeds their deeds, lots of branches, not many roots. What's the image from the verse, or what do you learn about this from the Jeremiah verse?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, what does the Jeremiah verse teach us about, Rabbi Elazar brings this verse. This verse doesn't even mention wind.
If you're alone and you're not part of society, you aren't going to recognize things that come your way.
Good. So the big-headed, big-branched, small-root, small-deed person, as opposed to the comment that they could topple in a windy day, the Jeremiah verse has a sense of isolated.
It's a little like what Sharon was saying when she was saying that the wisdom, if you keep it to yourself, is inward, where the deeds are the place that bring you into the community.
Nice. So that they may be a self-reflective tree in the desert, but they're a lone tree, right? And they're not in the forest. Right? Yeah?
So it goes back to what I was thinking about remote learning and learning without other people around. You won't have that experience, that nourishment that you get from having other teachers in your presence or students that you can learn from.
And, good.
Oh, well, I just wonder, and will not see when goodness comes. I took 1,000,000 classes on teaching special ed, 1,000,000. But until I started actually teaching children with needs and then had one of my own, I didn't know, the truth is I didn't know from needs until I was living it, and I was in that classroom and I was in that house every day. So I don't know if, and when goodness comes, we'll not see when goodness comes. I could have had all the brain learning I wanted. I could have read 1,000,000 books, but until I actually had it come into my space in reality and experience it, all the book learning in the world wouldn't matter.
Nice. And the idea of the midbar or the arava, the idea of being in a place that's melecha, it's a salty place. If
there's no nourishment.
There's no nourishment. If you were a tree Would you like to be the tree in the salty place? Or would you rather be one of the redwoods in the sequoia or in the rainforest or, whatever the alternate places are?
We can go outside and ask the tree.
What's that?
In San Diego, we can go outside and ask the tree.
And in San Diego, depends on what block you're on, right? My trees get well fed, but they wouldn't if it wasn't otherwise. All right. So the image from the verse is the image of one will not see good. So for me, reading back in terms of understanding the risk of being uprooted is a tree without a future. Right? So I like that image that the wisdom, but without deeds. One of these that comes up is without ties to the community. Is lo yireh tov, won't see the good things to come. Is in Jeremiah's text is a brutal. What do you call a negative prophecy? I mean, it's not a curse. He's offering as a vision. But it's a brutal thing to not see them, but better that there are good things coming. And that's one. And then to be in a sterile place. Yeah. Right? To be in a place that is arid, a place that is salty, as opposed to a place of real blossoming and nurturing.
And
nothing good comes.
memory.
All right. Looking around. Yep, Ellen?
Okay, in a psychological kind of viewpoint, if you have a ball and you fill it all up with one kind of beads, and then those beads, that color disappears, you need an empty ball. So that you need to have a whole lot of different places that you're getting your beads from, instead of just one place.
Okay. Good. And so because this one is by itself, we're in a place that doesn't have many beads. Nice. And it's interesting. This is one of those Mishnayot. I love. Oh, did you want to say something else? I'll hold my thought.
I just was wondering what kind of wisdom it is that doesn't appreciate the value of beads. Why are they calling it wisdom?
Nice.
How do consultants make their living?
Well, but even consultants are engaged in some way or other. But it's fun, and I think it's more fair after we've gone through both pieces to think about what really is the job title that we would condemn in this way. Who really are the trees that look good? Lots of branches. Again, there's virtue to this tree, but either in the language of the narrator of Elazar ben Azariah, they're at risk in a wind to topple over because they don't have roots, because they don't have deeds which root them, or in the language of Jeremiah, which seems to be less about the roots and more about in the wrong place to have a bright future. Who are those who have virtue about them, but it's less than ideal.
I'm thinking about the concept that Torah study, meaning sitting with the book, and to the exclusion of everything else in your life. You don't have responsibilities toward your family, you don't have responsibilities towards your community, you don't have all of these other things that are forgiven or put aside or whatever for the sanctity of this pure study of Torah could be interpreted in this way. That here's the wisdom of studying Torah, whatever, and then it goes back to whether you can study Torah without living it. But this idea that you just sit in your sanctuary with your book all day long, and nobody asks anybody anything of you, and you don't reach out to produce anything for anybody.
Nice. And this, give me one sec. This image of isolated is an important one in terms of reading the Mishnah. To what extent do we get the sense of the lone tree out in the wilderness, in a salty spot, which is that vision of the person who's kind of self-contained and therefore divorced, or are there forests of trees like this? Now they're not big and whatever else, but pockets, but that are still in the wrong place. The wrong place isn't as much about isolated as it is about not acting on the knowledge they have, or even not acting on simple knowledge, right? How many people have all sorts of esoteric, and whether that's intellectual or professional, whatever, knowledges, but fail to do the things that they learned how to do when they were 5, whether that means share or pick up their own trash or say please and thank you. And they may be able to literally split atoms, but they can't even treat people with derech eretz, going back to terms we've used in the past. So, multiple interpretations available coming around. Jackie, and then Louise?
No, I just think that it's more important what you do than what you...
Good. So the question about whether Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah agrees with you in terms of more important, we have the failure or the risk posed by the person who's at least out of balance. That is, plenty of wisdom, but not enough deed. So we'll look at the case he brings as the alternative in a second. Nice. So here it's got a sense of quantity, but I think everybody would agree. All right.
Yep.
You
said yes, he is in the necessity, he's every minute, but that brings us back to the seriousness.
Good. In what way?
Good.
Outstanding. So if you look at the very first of the pairings that Elazar ben Azariah brought in the last week, Mishnah having to do with Torah and Derech Eretz, right? In some way there's a parallel here. It's prettier, it's poetic. You know, we got a tree thrown in there. But the idea that it needs to be tied into, it can't just be here, it needs to be tied into here is lovely. Now, by the way, one of the things I love about this Mishnah, we're going to get to the second part in a second, is however it comes to be true, trace the history of Christianity through into this country. But we as Americans are a people that often that celebrate a certain kind of even rugged individualism. The adventurers, the explorers, those who are so committed to a cause that they set aside everything else and so forth. And we have, a condemnation of at least some of that, whether or not all those examples do it there, but as opposed to the extolling the virtue of the lone individual committed to their pursuit of knowledge, or their achievement of enlightenment, or their one cause in good, they become a tree with no roots that topples over in a wind, where they become a tree that is out in the desert in a salty place, and and all sorts of bad things will happen in a place that will not be inhabited. Right? All right, let's do the second person, the second tree, and the second Jeremiah quotation. Aval, but kol, anyone or everyone, shema'asav merubin mechokhmato. But now it's not in balance, but anybody whose deeds extend beyond their learning, their wisdom. What kind of tree are they like?
Few branches and many roots.
Good, few branches and many roots. So right away the distinction. What would you say about a tree? What would you say? We'll get to what Elazar ben Azariah says, and then the proof text of Jeremiah that he brings for it. But a tree, big branches, little roots, unless it really looks like dwarfed and top heavy and whatever, which I don't think is the image, also looks really attractive. Mm-hmm. What is a tree with very few branches and a lot of roots, if you can see them, I guess, I don't know. What does it look like?
It's not very
attractive. It's not a compelling image to me. We don't have a lot of art. Or when I plant the tree, you don't have a lot of shade. You probably don't have a lot of fruit. You probably, right? A tree with, again, I don't know how you would see that it has a lot of roots, because trees that have gnarly roots are kind of neat to look at sometimes if you can see them, but they don't make good trees in your backyard, and they do all sorts of problems and whatever. But all right, so Louise wanted to disagree with me, I think.
Okay, so being realistic, I have a pomegranate tree in my backyard that's probably as big as this room, and it was just too big, and we had it pruned and literally cut up half the tree. Okay.
Like all the way down to the trunk?
Well, yeah, because it went like this, we cut up half the tree. But the roots didn't know that half the tree was gone, and it produced fruit.
A whole lot of fruit.
Enormous pieces of pomegranates, like this big. So if I translate that into wisdom and this kind of fruit,
the amount of wisdom you would have would be greater and greater and greater in fewer and fewer areas.
So,
because, go ahead.
No, I don't want to interrupt you. I'm not sure that the parallel works. That is, I don't know. I'm not an arborist, but my guess is that your now half tree with the full root system produces more fruit than it would have if it was the whole tree with the same root system. Right? I'm not sure it produces better fruit or not. Maybe bigger fruit because it may produce fewer because of fewer branches. But I don't think that's the image here.
Okay.
I don't think.
That you would have more and more it's like if you go through a PhD program, more and more and more about less and less.
You would say, okay, now that you've got your half, cut it into a quarter.
You could have one golden apple.
Right, you could
get that one golden apple.
It's the guy with the horse who almost told him not to eat.
Okay, but if you have a PhD, you know more and more and more about less and less and less.
Right, but the premise here is the person who has less wisdom.
Who doesn't have a PhD.
Right, that's the first premise is what do you call a person who has less wisdom than deeds, and you call them a tree with very few branches and a whole lot of roots. And now the question is, does the person take that as a compliment or does it take that as an insult? Okay, and so we'll get to... I may have said that backwards, but you know what Rabbi Elazar says. If I said it backwards. Check the video. All right.
Just as you were saying that, maybe the idea is not that you have less wisdom than deeds in an absolute, in comparison to the other image,
right,
but in a comparative. So there's always the balance of wisdom and deeds. In the first tree, the wisdom is extreme, and the deeds are few or not existent. In the second tree, the wisdom might still be in the same place, but now we have overwhelming...
Correct.
Right?
That is, it's hard to compare the two people other than in the one person, their wisdom exceeds their deeds, and the other person, their deeds exceeds their wisdom. And we don't necessarily know, which is more or whatever else. But, yeah.
That's something that bothers me from the very beginning that you were reading it. How exactly do you...
Compare apples and oranges.
It's not even apples and oranges, it's bookshelves and apples.
Good, it's apples and SAT scores.
What?
Right. Correct. Correct. Correct.
This is more than that. What are we talking about?
So it seems to me the only way to do so is what I would call kind of a sociological statement. That is somebody who has wisdom beyond what you would call average wisdom, but has deeds, whatever those deeds are, but has deeds that are what you would call below average compared to the group. Because you can't really compare the wisdom to the deeds per se, but there's a norm, there's an average wisdom.
And we take it for granted, or we take it a priori that ma'asav means good deeds?
Oh, well, that's a neat question. Yeah. Right?
What's going on here?
Correct.
We're arguing about things, and I don't understand the text.
Well, but that's what we're arguing about. We're trying to figure out the text in fairness to conversation.
People are taking it way beyond arguing about the text.
Oh, so I don't know.
Telling me about trees that have this, that, and the branches. And
so I don't know.
It
all grows from the same seed.
Yeah. What what deeds are we talking about?
Good. So that's a reasonable question that we haven't dealt with. When we say that their wisdom either exceeds or doesn't exceed their deeds, do we mean, and I think I've heard two different things in play, two different ways of reading it. One is specifically their good deeds, and one is a more generic sense of their involvement in the world, more like one is more sort of like derech eretz, that is, one is more that they behave the right way, and one I would say is more like kemach, just that they're engaged in the world, right? So that I think that that's a reasonable split for the reading of what it means in comparing their wisdom to their deeds.
Okay, well, I'm getting that wisdom without merit, I guess, has this, if somebody is very articulate but it doesn't have any base, so once any kind of a storm brews, the tree falls over. But somebody that has deeds is heavily rooted in in making the world better.
Good. So in terms of heavily rooted, which is exactly the metaphor, let's read what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says about, not the Jeremiah quotation yet, but what does he say about this alternative type of person? Right? He says a person is like a tree with few branches and many roots. That Kol haruchot sheba'olam, all four of them, right? We know how many winds there are in the world. There are four of them. Even if they all came and blow upon that tree, they cannot cause it to move from its place. Which, by the way, if it ended there, you would have to ask if that's the image just of stubbornness, right? You could make it, which isn't. I agree with you clearly. It isn't here, but that's what the language says in terms of our understanding of idiom. But here it's clearly a virtue, right? As opposed to the tree that gets knocked over, this tree is steadfast, right? This tree, whatever the winds are that would come to do it, the winds of change, the winds that would just topple it, the winds that would erode it, the winds that would, we had the image of arid in the first Jeremiah quotation. This tree is impervious to those things because it is well rooted.
Well, right, and it ends with, it will not stop producing fruit.
Good, so you're already in the Jeremiah quotation.
Which is taken as a good, I assume,
correct.
For a tree to produce
I only want to make the comment that if we say about somebody that they are so set in their ways that they cannot be budged even by the greatest of hurricanes, that it's an idiom that sometimes is a compliment and sometimes isn't a compliment. Right. And in this context, I think it's clearly a positive virtue for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Lois?
Why is it positive if you're not too smart and you insist on doing things your way? I mean, and you can't change them. That's not so good.
Outstanding. So we have this question, and clearly a tradition that values the intellectual, right? And we're talking about here now a text that, whatever the context in which Elazar ben Azariah originally taught it and so forth, is become a classroom text of intellectual attainment of wisdom. But the value system that's present in it says better you should be more filled more with deeds, good deeds or engagement in the world, than the other way around. That's a remarkable intellectual tradition. Right now, it doesn't say you shouldn't have wisdom. I don't want to read this as saying, you know what, forget all wisdom and only have good deeds, because I don't think it says that. But I think it's a corrective for an intellectual tradition that values wisdom as a great virtue, to recognize that if what you have is so much wisdom, but you're not engaged in the world, or you're not actively doing good things, and those are two different ways of reading it, then it ends with you. You will be toppled over. You will be in a salty place. You will be, right, somehow bad. As opposed to, wisdom still a virtue, but your engagement in the community as deeds, or your engagement in the name of good things, specifically in terms of Maasav, as good deeds, then that will perpetuate, that will make you strong even in the face of those winds that would come to topple you over. And in a second we'll read the Jeremiah verse to see if that nuances it or not. Yeah, Ellen?
Okay, so I want to go backwards to last week's discussion, and where you said, it's not on the paper, that wisdom, nobody has wisdom until they're 65.
Okay.
So if we're talking about somebody who already has lived a life and they haven't put in those roots, like how can you could be wise because you're old and you haven't put those roots in, as compared to somebody who is at an age of wisdom and has reached out and gathered all this community.
Good, I would say three things. I would say one, that it was Rabbi Scott Meltzer, son of Ronald, who has that 65 line, and not Elazar ben Azariah.
I understand that.
I would say two, that I agree with Marilyn, that to make sense of this Mishnah, I have a broader understanding of how I would use wisdom than when wisdom, and I would see it as a collective, rather than when we have the three-part knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. But then I would say three, that you need not draw the line at 65 to make the comment, right? And that is, and this is, it's relevant in all sorts of ways, coming back to issues of educational system and issues of how we raise our children into young people, into families and careers, that if it's only about the acquisition of wisdom, forget the multiple choice stuff for a moment, if it's only about the acquisition of in the intellectual life, right? One of my favorite shows is The Big Bang Theory, which has lots of inappropriate things. Rabbinic disclaimer. But one of the things that one of the archetypes in the show that I love so much is this great character, Sheldon, who, when something will come up and they'll say, well, didn't you do that in college? And Sheldon will say, I graduated from college when I was 14. Yeah. Right? So there's somebody whose wisdom far exceeded and continues to exceed their deeds, because if it's only about the books, it maybe gets you into the best places to read and understand those really good books, but you miss a lot of life. When I was in third grade, the school wanted me to be in a fourth grade reading class, which I thought was really, really cool. First they wanted me to skip a grade, and my mom wouldn't let them. My mom, because she wanted school to be easy. I don't know why. My mom wouldn't let them because a good part of school is not just about accelerating and learning more and more, but it's about actually growing to be a better human being and whatever else. So in a similar sort of way, even without drawing a line at 65 and saying they're already old, if the pursuit is the pursuit of wisdom, and only the pursuit of wisdom, and not about deeds, whether contributing to one society or whether about just being engaged in one society, then that doesn't go anywhere. That's a salty place. That topples. Makes good television.
And so if you look at Sheldon and all the things, all the trouble that he gets into by having no roots, because it's not just that he graduated at 20. He
certainly has social issues.
He certainly has social issues, and he doesn't get it.
But he's got a great relationship to his mother.
Well, he does what she says.
We're starting a whole other class just on Big Bang Theory. All right, Marilyn, and then Koba.
We actually recorded and watched it.
All right, Marilyn and then Koba.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm kind of hearing and seeing in terms of not just what happens for the individual that we're talking about, for that individual tree, but that the tree without roots that falls, that's living by itself, it's done, that's the end. There's no continuity. There's no...
Silverstein would argue about that.
What?
Well, let her finish the thought. Let's come back to the comment.
Okay, so in this image, certainly,
right.
The idea is that this is it. There's no and the other tree, the tree that is out there in the world doing deeds, there's continuity. There's a chance that wisdom, however it is, whether it's for good or bad, Lois might say, could be passed on. That the community could exist. And that goes a little bit, education has to be a piece of that, studying Torah has to be a piece of that, but I kind of sense, and I don't know whether it's my personal view of what I want to interpret it, is that every time we talk about studying Torah, we talk about living Torah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I get that sense that this is another way to say, if you only look at studying Torah as you in the book, you're missing the point.
Nice. And I think that is the nightmarish use, not just of it will be toppled over, it will knock it over, but the verb before, that it will be uprooted. Right? And that's why the image of the tree stuck in a salty place is coming from Jeremiah, is such a dreadful image of sterility, of end of the line, of isolated, even if it's not withered at the moment, it's got beautiful branches, but it's going to be withered. And the image of the second tree is it can survive a drought. It can survive hot spell, and it will bear fruit that will perpetuate and propagate. And so the tree image becomes clear that given the choice to be a tree with a strong root system by water that can survive drought, that can survive heat, that will bear fruit, is clearly the more ideal choice. And then if you were to ask, so which is the more ideal choice? The choice is somebody who really has deeds. Not to devalue wisdom, right? But and again, it's a major choice. Does deeds mean that they're a righteous person? Or does deeds mean that they're engaged in the world? Is it what we called before derech eretz, or is it what we called before kemach, right? Broadly. And I would take either one as a possibility because they both tie to the same sage. But the more powerful, the more enduring, the more fecund, the more fertile image is the one that's not. And by the way, the text that goes with it, I feel like I say this now every Wednesday, but one of the texts that goes with it in terms of the emphasis on engagement, and here I would make it about engagement, not necessarily good deeds, but deeds, engagement in the world, is the Rashbi story, is the Shimon Bar Yochai story, where he becomes literally just wisdom. He and his son for 12 years in a cave, get naked, bury themselves up to the neck, and literally are talking heads. And when he comes out of the world, he's so upset that everybody else is so engrossed in mundane matters. They're farming, right? They're literally engaged in the perpetuation of the world, that things should seed and bear fruit and so forth. And he's furious and he destroys them, and God, slaps him and says, get back in the cave. And you're not done yet. You need to spend a little bit more time. A little bit more time. But it's amazing to me that the tradition doesn't extol Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave as being the ideal, because it places such a great emphasis on the intellectual. And I mean that, and that's how I would use wisdom here. I mean that broadly. But separated from, or in excess so that it truly overshadows engagement in this world, or good deeds. I like the engagement in the world reading. It becomes, bane, not beneficence. It becomes a problem, not a virtue. All right, I think last time I picked Jackie first, so Louise and then Jackie. Oh, I picked Kopa, thank you. So, but last time I did do that, but this time it's Kopa's turn. Thank you. I apologize.
That's spelled correctly.
I'm listening.
The thing is, you can collect wisdom very easily.
Thank you.
And if you don't ground it in action, it loses its strength. I think that's the image that I'm getting at.
Nice. So kind
and
of
the fact that wisdom is easier to collect than actual working on it. In the avodah.
Maybe. I may say maybe. But it's neat because it's a much tighter reading of the Mishnah. That it becomes that what's at risk of being lost is the wisdom that's been gained. And that the deeds, the teaching of it, or the engagement with it, or however it's understood, becomes the rooting of that wisdom. So that it is kind of the top-heavy image. That if it becomes just too much upstairs, it'll collapse. Louise and then Jackie and then Lois.
What I find so interesting is what's not here.
Okay.
It talks about wisdom being more important than deeds, and deeds being more important than wisdom, but it never talks about the need for balance.
Well, if by balance you mean equal, right? Because not all things are in balance that aren't balanced. The balance is the thing that weighs them. It doesn't mean that the things are necessarily balanced. But it doesn't say it doesn't tell you what is the tree for the person whose wisdom equals their deeds.
Yes.
True. Doesn't. Yep. I don't know.
Okay. If we're going to continue and use a tree as
the metaphor.
Yes, as a metaphor. Thank you. However, if you plant a tree where there's no water, you don't have much wisdom. And secondly, even if you plant a tree where there is water, if you don't take care of it and you don't nurture it, you're not going to have a fruitful tree.
Nice.
So you have to do both.
Very, very nice. So it is neat to think about how the tree got to be like that, or got to be where it is in terms of it. So which isn't in the Mishnah either, but very, very nice. And you do need both. I also like, I didn't really think about it, that the choice of verbs for Elazar ben Azariah is interesting. Again, the uprooting verb is a nightmare verb for me in terms of its implications. The flipping verb isn't a nightmarish verb. There are places where we use it and we use it as a virtue. It's a descriptive verb. But so that tree's at risk of being turned over, right? But the other tree won't even be moved, which is a funny verb, by the way, because I can understand an image of wind coming that'll turn a tree over, but how many images do you have of trees that move? You know, I know they sway or whatever, but can't get the tree to budge. That's the other great story, I know. Oh, that's not what I was thinking of.
The comparison between
Correct.
a cedar and a, what's the cane? Cane would be
cane.
Like
bamboo,
whatever.
maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe they were
you
swaying.
can turn with the wind, sway with the
Correct.
wind, and not stand upright and then break.
Correct. I just like the image of moving in the wind, which rather than swaying, I don't know if there's a good Mishnaic Hebrew term to sway, but the tree won't be moved. You know, it's like, I don't know, I would go on. Lois.
The answer is blowing in the
Correct, but the tree's not. Lois.
What about balance? What if all this said is it's important to keep a proper balance between wisdom and deeds? What would we be talking about?
We would be going back to Mishnah 10 in the same chapter.
So people say go back.
Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa.
9 in our counting.
Okay. כל שמעשיו מרובים מחוכמתו, חוכמתו מתקיימת. וכל שחוכמתו מרובה מעשיו,
Nice.
חוכמתו מתקיימת. So why is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah dragon chaining? I mean, seriously.
But we have a different way of presenting a similar teaching, just to be interesting. Here it's in the context that comes after the 4 dyads of last week, and it's now in a context where we have extended metaphor and proof texting, right? As opposed to in the Hanina ben Dosa 3:9 in our notebook, we have like a philosophical statement. This is this, and this is what happens if it isn't, right? And so, it's kind of interesting. There are those who learn their wisdom in a philosophy class with Professor Hanina ben Dosa, and there are those who learn the wisdom in a poetry class, maybe, I don't know exactly what, but with Elazar ben Azariah.
So that we're in quotes, we discussed this in 3:11, and this one it's really R 3:9.
Maybe.
Just before the.
Maybe.
Because I was looking at 3:11 and I couldn't find.
Yeah, I think that's probably 3:9 in our numbering system. You're talking about from the Chaim of Volozhin. I think so. Well, too many people talking at once. Jeff?
Is it possible that wisdom and deeds actually are the same? Like, deeds are the root. I mean, that's where we grow, because we know if we're teaching, learning Torah, and you do it inside of you're doing it. You're practicing. That's the deed.
Good. And to go back to last week's, you can't. And this is like in some ways it goes, and I don't want to go to Shel Silverstein, but in some ways it goes to my critique of the book as well. You can't have a tree without branches, right? You can't have deeds without wisdom. That was the first teaching of Elazar ben Azariah, right? Or going back to 3:9 to Hanina ben Dosai, that the question is about the balance and what is the appropriate balance, or to say it differently, what happens out of balance. But it's one tree, and it's a tree that needs branches and needs roots. And by the way, and this is why in my mind, I liked my earlier comment. You extolled the virtues of, I think Louise did, about needing the roots to take in the nutrients and the water. And I made, did Jackie make it? And I made the comment about needing the leaves to bring in the energy of the sun, is both of those, the roots and the branches, are integral to making the tree a tree, and are ways in which the